So I'll speak about vortex ring, and in fact, my talk will be some follow-up of the beautiful lecture by Pierre Germain yesterday. He introduced in his talk the problems of vortex filaments and vortex tube in both inviscid and viscous fluids. And what I will do in this talk is just to concentrate on a particular example, which is the simplest one, the case where the vortex under consideration is circular. I mean, the filament is just a circle, so you have a lot of symmetries. The problem is massively simpler, but you can also hope for more precise results. And this is based on joint work with Vladimir Shverak from Minneapolis, and also on ongoing work, because as you can see, we still do not have the result we would like to obtain in this, even in this simple case. Good. So what is a vortex ring? Well, it was already said, this will be a three-dimensional flow for which the vorticity vector is essentially concentrated in a solid torus. I mean, this kind of flows is common in nature. It's easy to produce in experiments, but it's not so easy to visualize because usually you don't see clearly the motion of fluid particles in the air or in water. But if you have some dust, some smoke, some particles that are carried by the fluid, maybe you can see where the motion actually takes place. And this is the case in this beautiful picture, which was taken of a volcano. In fact, this picture is a snapshot of a video. And if you look at the video, you see that the smoke ring is not steady. It will go upwards due to self-advection. And this is supposed to be the effect of the binormal flow. Okay, so the next slide has the same information, but maybe in a more schematic way. So you have here a vortex ring. So the vorticity vector is concentrated in the torus in this blue region. So it's a vector, so you should imagine that it's like the electric current in a loop. And the black arrows denote the induced velocity field, exactly like it's induced by the vorticity exactly in the same way as the magnetic field is induced by the electric current in a loop. It's just the same law. But for fluids, of course, we have seen yesterday that vorticity is advected by the velocity field. So this is not steady in the laboratory frame. This will move to the right, I mean, according to the direction of the arrows here. And the net effect will be a translation to the right, which is denoted by this large red arrow. And we even have some asymptotic formula for the translation speed, which involves the geometric, I mean, the parameters of the vortex ring. So important parameters for the vortex ring are at least three. So this is a torus, so there is a large radius, capital R, and a small radius, small r. And I will also always consider the case where the aspect ratio, small r over capital R, is small, so that you have some thin vortex tube. Of course, if they are of the same order, you get a fat donut, and this is not the case of flow we'll consider. And then there is a third parameter, which is gamma. It was denoted by alpha in the talk by Pierre Germain, which is the total circulation. So you're obtaining by cutting the torus by a cross section and computing the flux of the vorticity vector through the cross section. This is independent of the cross section, and this gives this parameter gamma. And the asymptotic formula for the velocity field is gamma over 4 pi r, so proportional to the curvature, times log of the inverse aspect ratio. And this is the binormal flow formula in the particular case of a circle. Okay, good. So this is this kind of flow that we want to consider. So here, of course, we can construct such solution and study the stability of such solution not within the whole framework of 3D Navier-Stokes, but with some symmetries. And for imposing symmetries, I will suppose that my vortex filament is in the horizontal plane, and I assume that it will move upwards so that the symmetry axis will be the vertical axis. And I will use, of course, cylindrical coordinates, r, theta, and z in the usual way. So I have a standard notation for the unit vectors in all directions. And now I consider a velocity field which depends only on r and z. R is the distance to the symmetry axis. Z is the vertical coordinate. So this is axisymmetry. You don't depend on the angle theta. And in addition, I assume that the velocity vector has no component along E theta. So you just have a radial velocity and a vertical velocity, and this is without swirl. So it's pretty much like in 2D, you have only two variables and two components of the velocity field. And the analogy goes further, because if you compute the vorticity vector, then it has only one non-zero component, which is along E theta. So I'm certainly not considering Beltrami fields in that talk, just the contrary. The vorticity is orthogonal to the velocity field in the flow we consider. And this omega theta is the two-dimensional curl of the velocity field. So it's pretty much the same formula as in 2D, but there are some differences that will appear later on. So most of what we know about, vortex rings is obtained by studying either the Euler equation or the Navier-Stokes equation within the framework of axisymmetric flows without swirl. Okay. So I will mainly speak about Navier-Stokes, about viscous case, like in the talk by Pierre Germain, but I put just a transparency here to recall the great amount of work that has been done, and it's related to the topic of this workshop, although it's not new, for existence and properties of vortex rings for the Euler equation. So for the Euler equation, as was mentioned already yesterday, of course, you cannot consider a vortex filament, because a vortex filament would be to set small r is equal to 0. And if you set small r is equal to 0 in this formula, the speed is infinite, you have no solution. So in the ideal case, you have to consider a vortex tube with a finite size for the cross section. Okay. And then, of course, you have the problem of determining what is the vorticity distribution among the cross section. Okay, and you have a lot of choices. Like for 2D vortices, you have a lot of choices for the vorticity distribution. The same probably is true here. If you want to construct a solution of 3D Euler, which is stationary in a moving frame or uniformly translating in the laboratory frame, and this is what you want to do. Okay, so mathematically, this was done first by Frankel, I guess, in a very beautiful papers at the early 70s. And this was done first by this was for small aspect ratio, and this was by considering some perturbation argument and fixed point argument to obtain some vortices. But then more results were obtained by recasting the problem in a variational form and obtaining as a solution of some variational problems. But there are several ways of doing that. You can write a variational problem for the Stokes stream function or for the vorticity. For the Stokes stream function, it was done by Frankel and Berger and continuated by many others. And for the vorticity, this was advertised by Benjamin in the 70s and studied by Friedman and Turkington and other people as well. Okay, so there are a lot of results, but we are lacking still a global picture of what we can obtain. It's much more complicated than vortices in 2D. In particular, we do not have any uniqueness result in the large, in the sense that the different variational methods construct solutions, but we don't know if these are the same solutions. There are technical differences in the construction. So, but okay, we do expect that we have a lot of these uniformly translating vortex rings, exactly like we have a lot of different two-dimensional vortices in the plane. And typically, there is an infinite dimensional family of such solutions indexed by the choice of the vorticity distribution in the cross section. Okay, so in some sense, as long as you study the ideal case, you don't have any canonical object because you have a choice to make. And this was there is another solution which was denoted by S-plan B by Pierre Germain, which is to say, okay, let's consider the viscous case. In the viscous case, then you can start with a filament. So you can start with just a curve with thickness 0 and let the vorticity transform it to you into a vortex ring at later time. If you do that, you just have the geometry at the beginning, and then everything else is determined by the equation. So this is a very nice approach in the sense that the evolution equation decides for you what will be the vorticity profile in the cross section, and this will be typically a Gaussian vorticity profile like the Ozane vortex in 2D case. So this is the strategy I will explain here also in the case of the axisymmetric flows without a swirl. Okay, so the overview of my talk is very simple. In the first part, I will just recall a basic existence result saying that, okay, in this very symmetric situation, we are like in 2D, so you have global existence of smooth solutions in scale invariant spaces, okay. Then I will concentrate on the part where we try to solve the Cauchy problem with just a filament as initial data. This is exactly the parallel of what Pierre Germain did for general curves, but I will do it only for circles. Okay, the result will be easier, but also the uniqueness claim a little bit stronger. And then in the last part, which is still under construction, I will try to explain the goal and the difficulties we have in controlling the solution in the vanishing viscosity limit. And this is in this limit that you can recover the binormal flow as a rigorous result within the Navier-Stokes equation. Okay, so this is more or less the plan of the talk. So let me go to part one, which is very basic. So let's consider the 2D vorticity equation for axisymmetric flows without swirl. So it's very simple. You have a scalar function, omega theta, and it evolves like dt omega theta. There is some diffusion terms, which is basically the Laplacian in cylindrical coordinates. You have advection by the velocity field u, and you have some vortex stretching. I mean, for axisymmetric flows without swirl, we still have some little vortex stretching. In 2D, you don't have, but in that case, you do have. I mean, the vorticity can get amplified. You don't have maximum principle for omega theta. Okay. Now, the velocity field itself has to be constructed in terms of omega theta. So you solve the elliptic equation, divergence of u is equal to 0, curl of u is equal to omega theta, but you don't solve it in the whole space. You solve it in the half plane because the only variables you have are r and z, and r should be positive and z should be anything in r. So you have some artificial boundary at r is equal to 0, and you have to impose boundary conditions, and you find that you have to impose Dirichlet boundary condition for the vorticity and the radial velocity, and Neumann boundary condition for the vertical velocity. So this is a well-defined problem. U is a function of omega. You plug it into the equation, and you have a well-posed equation that you can study. Okay. Now, I mentioned that you have some vortex stretching here, but it's harmless, in fact, in this case, because it was discovered very long time ago that you can make it disappear just by introducing an auxiliary quantity, which is omega theta divided by the distance to the symmetry axis. I don't know physically the meaning of such a quantity, a vorticity divided by a distance. So I denote it by theta because theta means nothing. And so I have a new quantity, and this quantity satisfies an advection diffusion equation. So for that quantity, you have some a priori estimates, conservation, or at least control of all LP norms. And it is using this equation that you can obtain global existence of solutions like in 2D. Okay, so let me recall just, let me introduce possible function spaces for solving the Cauchy problem. So as it was explained by Pierre Germain, it's very important if you want to be able to treat filaments to work in scale invariant function spaces. Otherwise, you are not in the correct framework. So for my quantity zeta, I mean, I am looking for simple spaces, okay, not Bezoff spaces and things like that, just Lebesgue spaces, if you allow me. So for zeta, it's just L1. And for omega theta, which is the vorticity, well, it's L1 too, but with another measure. I mean, I'm just confused. I'm in the half space, R positive, Z in R, which I denote by omega. What is a natural measure to work in that space? Well, probably R, dr, dz is a natural measure because it comes from the Lebesgue measure in R3. But if you want to emphasize the analogy with the 2D case, you may be tempted to use the naive 2D measure dr, dz, which I will do. And in that case, this is just L1 for this measure for the vorticity, which is my scale invariant Lebesgue space. Okay. Okay, let's take that. And then you have this very standard result. I mean, we published it in 2015, but it could have been done in the 60s after Fujita and Kato, because it's exactly the same proof and the same idea. It tells you that the Cauchy problem for the axisymmetric vorticity equation without swirl is globally well posed in L1. Okay, you take any initial data in L1, you have a unique global solution which is continuous in L1, and it becomes infinitely smooth immediately, and the L1 norm is on non-increasing, and you have some information about the solution at time 0 and at time infinity. This is exactly what you have in 2D, except for the last line. The last line is wrong in 2D, it's not true, but the rest is absolutely the same. You have a global solution, so you have a framework where you have nice solutions, and of course you don't have singularity formation whatsoever. This is like 2D. Okay, now this was already done in the talk by Pierre Germain, but this is not surprising. I mean, the data we consider are already covered by some general results for Navier-Stokes without any symmetry. For instance, if you take omega theta in L1 and you take the corresponding vorticity vector, then it belongs to the Morris space M3½ defined by this norm. So you can apply the very nice result by Giga and Miyakawa in the 80s, sorry, which gives you at least local well-posedness. Okay. And of course, the corresponding velocity field belongs to BMO -1. I mean, a very large scale invariant space. So you can, if you prefer, invoke the celebrated result and Tataru and also obtain local existence. So it's absolutely not a surprise that we can solve uniquely the Cauchy problem in these spaces, because even in the case without symmetry, this is covered by some existing results. Now, for the global well-posedness, the fact that you don't have any singularity formation and so on, this is due to the, additional a priori estimates due to the quantity zeta, which I mentioned. And this was first done in the 60s by the Russian school, Ladizhenskaya and Ukovsky and Yudovich. I do not know if it's independent or correlated, I don't know, but at least there are 2 papers where they prove global solutions. Well, they are not working in scale invariant spaces because, okay, they choose to use finite energy solution. They use, in fact, the energy inequality, which is not necessary to obtain global solution in that case, but you can use it if you have it. And this was a little bit simplified. For instance, you can just assume U is in H1², but this is still not scale invariant, okay? So H.1² would be scale invariant, but this is here H1², okay? So you can have global solutions. So the result I was mentioning was just to say that if you take just L1, scale invariant, you don't care about energy inequality or finite energy solution, you have global well-posedness as could be expected. Okay, so these are more for a smooth, say, L1 solution. Now, I don't want to consider L1 solution because I would like to study the Cauchy problem with a vortex filament. What is a vortex filament? I mean, in my cylindrical coordinate is just a Dirac mass located at some point RZ for some positive R. Okay, a Dirac mass in my picture is just a vortex filament, okay, with 0 thickness, just a curve. Okay, so we'd like to consider measures instead of L1 function. So, okay, let's consider the space of all finite measures. So if you have such a measure, you have an absolutely continuous part, which is an L1 density, and this is the part that we already considered. And then you may have an atomic part, which is a collection of Dirac masses, if of which corresponds to some circular filament. You could also have some singularly continuous part, which would correspond to vortex sheets, but let me ignore that for the moment. Okay, so this is a nice space with equipped with total variation norm. So you can consider the Cauchy problem in that space. Are we able to reproduce the proof of theorem 1 in that case? And the answer is no. If you just use the proof, which I didn't mention, but as you imagine, it's just fixed point argument on the integral equation using spaces like Kato told us to use. If you do that, you obtain theorem 2, where you have some smallness condition on the initial data. I mean, it's known that if you are in a scale invariant, for a scale invariant PDE in a scale invariant space, if you consider a space which is large enough to contain homogeneous data, which cannot be approximated within the space by smooth solution, you cannot prove even a local well-posedness result. You have to impose some smallness on the data. And the smallness is only involving the atomic part. I mean, the smooth part can be as large as we want. You can even have large vortex sheets, I don't care. but the atomic part should be small. I mean, if you have just a one single Dirac mass with coefficient gamma, this quantity is just the absolute value of gamma. So I'm imposing that gamma divided by nu is the kinematic viscosity, should be smaller than some universal constant. It is what was mentioned by Pierre Germain yesterday. He said several times alpha divided by square root of nu should be small. But of course, it's wrong, it's incorrect. It's alpha divided by nu, because alpha and nu have the same physical dimensions. So this should be corrected. But this is exactly the same condition that we meet here. So if you impose that condition, then of course you have a unique global solution. Okay. Is the theorem true without this condition? I don't know. In the 2D case, it is. In 2D case, you have the corresponding statement when you erase here the red part and the green part. But I don't know if it's true in the axisymmetric case. Probably yes, but this has not been done, and I'm not sure that there are not some little difficulties. Okay, please a second. Okay, so this theorem does not cover the case of even a single isolated large vortex filament. You have to do something else because you cannot do it just by perturbation argument. Okay. So this problem was tackled by a paper by Feng and Schwerak, which was published 5 years ago, where they prove if you take just the axisymmetric vorticity equation, initial data which correspond to one filament, but one filament with arbitrary large circulation compared to the viscosity, located anywhere in your plane, then you have a global solution which satisfies some a priori estimates, and such that the corresponding measure converges weakly to the filament as t goes to 0. So you have a solution of the Cauchy problem for an arbitrary an arbitrary vortex filament. But this was proved by an approximation procedure, just modifying the initial data, solving globally using theorem 1, obtaining a priori estimates, and then passing to the limit. And then, of course, you lose any information about uniqueness. So it's just an existence result, but it's already some step. And what we proved finally last year, it was published last year, is that, in fact, you have existence and uniqueness. If you have just one single Dirac mass in your data, so one single vortex filaments with arbitrary circulation located anywhere and with arbitrary viscosity, but everything fixed, you have a unique global solution. This solution is unique among the set of solutions which are uniformly bounded in L1 and for which the measure converges weakly to the filament as t goes to 0. So this establishes the existence of a unique object which can be called the viscous vortex ring. It's a solution of the Cauchy problem with a Dirac mass as initial data. In 2D, this is explicit. This is called the Lamb-Ozane vortex. You have translation invariance, so it doesn't matter where you put your initial vortex, and it's solution of a linear equation. So if you double gamma, you just double the solution. It's not the case here. Its solution, it depends non-trivially on the initial location and non-trivially on the circulation parameter, because it's really a solution of a nonlinear equation. And of course, there is no explicit formula. But we have a family of solutions, which is sort of the fundamental solution of the axisymmetric vorticity equation, and it's given by this theorem. Okay. And we even have, like in the talk by Pierre Germain, some short-time asymptotic description of what the solution is. I take the solution at time t, and I subtract what I could be called the caloric extension of the initial filament. This is not exactly true because I'm in the axisymmetric case, but this is basically what you would obtain by solving just the heat equation with the same initial data. So the full solution minus the solution of the heat equation, you take the difference in L1 norm, which is a scale invariant norm, and this is something like square root of t log t as t goes to 0. So at least for small times, you know asymptotically what your solution is looking like. Okay, good. So this theorem here is in some sense clean, in the sense, the difference with respect to what Pierre Germain did, of course, the first difference is that it's massively simpler because we are dealing just a 2D problem instead of the full 3D problem. That being said, the uniqueness result is much stronger. In the sense that it's not possible, I think, to to relax these assumptions here. I mean, if you don't assume that your solution is uniformly bounded in L1, then the result is wrong even for the heat equation. So certainly this is necessary. And once you have uniform boundedness in L1, then the convergence here in the weak sense of measure is equivalent to the convergence in the sense of distribution. So you're just saying that your solution should converge in the sense to the distribution to the initial data as t goes to 0. And this is probably the weakest way of imposing initial data. If this is not true, in which sense can you say that these are the initial data for your solution? So this is absolutely natural. You cannot improve this result. And this is exactly what you have in 2D. Okay, good. So this aspect is satisfactory. Now, as for the asymptotic description of the solution, this is, of course, not very satisfactory because this is for fixed viscosity as t goes to 0. Because as you see here, you compare the solution to the diffusive extension of the initial data at the initial location. But of course, this is not what the solution is doing. We expect that at least for small viscosity, you will see the vortex ring moving. So you should have some binormal, I mean, the binormal flow should make the solution move. So as was already indicated by Pierre Germain, you should compare this solution not to this solution of the heat equation with the initial filament, but with a translated filament, at least to take into account the advection, okay? But this is not what this formula is doing. So this you cannot use to control the solution and to exhibit the binormal flow. It's just not there, and you have to do something better if you want to see the binormal flow, even in this simple problem. And this is what I would like to discuss in the remaining time I have, okay? I will completely skip, okay, just one word. It's a unique global solution. Uniqueness here is only within the framework of axisymmetric solutions. I mean, in my equation here, of course, as was discussed also by Pierre Germain, there are strong doubts that this solution is unique in the large. I mean, even in some scale invariant spaces, if you don't have the symmetry, okay? You could have bifurcation and so on. So this is a uniqueness result, but in 2D, I mean, in axisymmetric geometry. Good. I will skip completely the proof because otherwise I will not be able to complete my talk. I will just mention that there are many steps. There are some a priori estimates, some Gaussian bounds. And the crucial step is introducing self-similar variables. Because, of course, you start with the filament. For small times, you have a viscosity nu, so it doesn't stay like a filament. It's mollified, and you obtain a vortex tube. And the thickness of the vortex tube, which is the diffusion length, which is square root of nu t. Okay, so everything happens in a tubular neighborhood of your filament, and the size of which is square root of nu t. So this is exactly what this self-similar variable is doing. You introduce new variables which are located at the vortex position and which measure the distances in unit of the diffusion length, r minus r bar over square root of nu t, and the same for z. And then you transform all your variables into these self-similar variables. You obtain an RST equation, which is not so complicated, and you have to study this equation. And okay, through a lot of steps, you can prove the uniqueness result by studying this equation. Okay, this is a different story. Let me jump to the new part. So the new part is the following one. Okay, so we start from the beginning again. I take just a circular vortex filament as initial data. So this circular vortex filament has a radius, which is r bar. It's located anywhere in the vertical position because it doesn't matter. It has a circulation, which is just the strength of the vortex, I mean the coefficient in front of the Dirac mass. And you study the Navier-Stokes equation with some viscosity nu. So what are the time scales that you can form with these parameters? Let's do physics, okay? So the first one is the convective time scale, which is r squared over gamma. This is geometrically, say, I mean, roughly speaking, up to factors of 4 pi and logarithmic corrections. This is the distance that your vortex ring is expected to travel according to the binormal flow. It's not the distance, it's the time needed so that the vortex ring travels a distance which is of the same order of the diameter. Okay, you would like to see your vortex ring really moving, but of course in Euler everything is scale invariant, so you have to make intrinsic definitions. So the convective time is how much time you need to have your initial vortex filament translating by a distance which is of the same order as the radius or the diameter. This is the convective time scale, nothing to do with viscosity. And now you have the diffusive time scale, which is the time needed so that the diffusion destroys your vortex. I mean, as you will see, this is a time so that the diffusion length, square root of nu t, become of the same order as the radius itself. So you start with a thin vortex, it becomes a fat donut, and at some point you obtain something spherical, and you have no advection at all, and your vortex is destroyed. You just have a diffusion, okay? So this is the diffusive time scale. And the regime we want to consider, it's nu over gamma very small. I mean, nu is much less than gamma, which is exactly the converse of the condition we had in theorem 2, which means that the convective time scale is much smaller than the diffusive time scale. So I want to observe over a non-trivial distance, I want to see my vortex ring traveling and still being very nicely localized. I mean, the aspect ratio should stay small for the whole observation time, which I hope will be the convective time. Okay, good. So this in mind, I have two small parameters that I will have to keep in mind. The first one is nu over gamma, which tells you that you are considering high Reynolds number flows. And the second one is just the aspect ratio, so the diffusion length divided by the radius. This parameter also has to stay small. So I saw in some sense, I have to do a two-parameter expansions if I want to construct an approximate solution of my problem. So I will focus on the parameter epsilon, which is time dependent. This is the main one, but there is a delta parameter also hidden in the background. Okay. So what shall we do? So you want to construct a more precise approximate solution. We already have an approximate solution here. This is in some sense an approximate solution, but it's no good. I mean, you don't see the binormal flow here. So let's do better. And to do a better choice, we introduce now new self-similar coordinates, but it's exactly the same as before, except that instead of being located at the initial position of the vortex, they follow some evolution of the vortex, which is still unknown at this stage of the calculation. So it's like modulated self-similar variables. You have some r bar of t and z bar of t, which is supposed to be the evolution of the radius and the vertical position of the vortex ring. I don't know what it will be exactly. And I make self-similar coordinate transformation using these new variables here. So obtain an even more complicated evolution equation, of course, which again, the diffusion terms, they are the convection terms, which are very dangerous because there is 1 over nu and nu is small. And you have some additional advection terms, which is just due to the fact that I'm in a translating frame, okay? And what I would like to do is to construct an approximate solution of this equation and maybe finally show that the true solution is close to this approximate solution, okay? So how can it be done? So this becomes nasty. It's like a boundary layer expansions. I mean, when you start doing this perturbation extension, you get lost very rapidly. So let me just tell you how it works. So this is the equation again, I just copied it. And then I take an approximate solution. F is the vorticity, U is the velocity. So some F0 plus epsilon F1 plus epsilon square F2 and so on, some perturbative expansion. And we know what F0 should be. It's the Gaussian profile because we see it already in the bad approximation I had in the previous theorem. So this is what is imposed by diffusion. It tells you basically for short time what you will see. I mean, for short time, diffusion is more efficient than advection, even with the binormal flow. So it's just like the heat equation. The heat equation out of Dirac masses produces just Gaussian distribution. That's a fact. So certainly you know what F0 and U0 should be. It's exactly the profile of the self-similar solution in 2D that is called the Lamb-Ozane vortex. So this is already what we have is here as a main ingredient. And then we have to find what are the higher order corrections. And also we have to determine the velocity, the radial and the vertical velocity of the position of the vortex ring, because these are not known a priori. So we also have a perturbative expansion for these quantities which are not known. Okay. By the way, I put this expansion in power of epsilon, but there are also some logarithm of 1 over epsilon that will occur, but I just, okay, don't indicate this explicitly because it's complicated enough. Okay, so let me just show you maybe how you determine the first profile. I mean, this one was already covered in the previous theorem, but I would like to determine the first correction to this profile, which gives you the deformation of the vortex ring. Is no longer Gaussian, but you will have some deformation. Like in 2D, when you take two interacting vortices, they do not stay radially symmetric. They get deformed due to mutual interaction. So it's the same here. Okay. So, so this becomes ridiculous because I didn't introduce anything, so the formula cannot be read. But you find that to leading order, you can say that the radius of the ring doesn't change, which is a good point. And the vertical velocity has a formula like in the binormal flow approximation. So gamma over 4 pi r0, it's exactly the same prefactor. Logarithm of the inverse of the aspect ratio, perfect, plus a constant, okay. In practical application, this constant is usually of the same order of log of 1 over epsilon. So certainly when you take a leading order approximation, of course, mathematically for epsilon very small, I know that log of 1 over epsilon is bigger than any constant, but in practical flow, they are pretty much of the same order. So I take all this. But this quantity V is not known a priori. I mean, forget about this formula. It's not known, okay? Now, for the profile itself, F1, which is my first order correction, I'll obtain some kind of elliptic equation. Lambda F1 is equal to something which is more or less given. So I didn't introduce notation, but this is all depending only of F0. So you know it from the previous step. This is known, this is known, this is known except for this V, which I don't know what it is, okay? Now this operator lambda was already denoted by lambda in the talk by Pierre Germain. It appears when linearizing the Ozane vortex in 2D. And okay, I will not have a formula for it, but I don't want to explain it in detail, but it's just some skew adjoint operator. But this operator has a kernel. So you cannot solve this equation with an arbitrary right-hand side because you must be orthogonal to the kernel of lambda, otherwise you cannot solve it. Okay, so you have a solvability condition that must be imposed. And this solvability condition fixes the value of the velocity V here. Okay, so the velocity, the log of 1 over epsilon is automatic, but the order 1 correction to it, which is very important in application, it appears here as a solvability condition to find the correction to the shape of the vortex. And using a stupid calculation, you find that V is 3/2 log 2 plus 1/2 of the Euler constant minus 1. And this we recover formula that are known. I mean, in the literature, I mean, such kind of precise asymptotic expansion for the speed of vortex ring was, I think, initiated by Dyson in the late 19th century and then repeated by many others. So, for instance, in the paper by Safman, you have a general formula in the inviscid case, which gives you this constant as a function of what you choose for the vorticity distribution in the cross section. And if you plug the choice of the Gaussian vorticity distribution, as is clear in the viscous case, then the formula of Safman gives you exactly this constant. So you recover here exactly what is known in the paper by Safman or the most sophisticated one by Fukumoto and Moffat from 2000. So you recover the known formula for the binormal flow plus the next correction by this formula. And then you have this F1, so you have achieved the first order correction of your profile. And then you can go to higher and higher corrections. So this is even more elusive as before. So for the velocity, vertical velocity, you take, I mean, this is well known, you have the binormal flow plus this constant, and the rest is epsilon square log of 1 over epsilon. And you can even, in that case, compute explicitly this term, if you wish. That is done in the paper by Fukumoto and Moffat. By the way, Fukumoto and Moffat use very complicated match asymptotic expansion like Ting and Tung in the 60s and so on. And I think This is not needed in the present case because I do straightforward expansion and I find exactly the same results. I think it's just because they want to use that technique, but in that case, I think the expansion can be done really honestly, okay? For the radius of the vortex ring, well, it depends. In my definition of the radius shrinks a little bit to higher order corrections, but if you use different definition of what the radius of a vortex ring should be, it could expand as well. So it depends on the definition. Here, I use a definition which is like the vortex center, and this one shrinks a little bit. So you can compute that. And for the profiles, you obtain some elliptic or parabolic equations, depending a little bit on details that I have no time to explain. But you can solve perturbatively in principle to any order. We computed this more or less explicitly to third or fourth order because we need that. So you can build just an asymptotic expansion of your solution. And if you plug this into the Navier-Stokes equation, you don't obtain a solution, of course, but you obtain a small remainder. Okay, so it's not a solution, it's an approximate solution where some of the inverse power of nu that you have in the denominator here, which are very bad because nu t is epsilon square, so it's like having the small parameter in the denominator, are compensated because we have a good approximation. Okay. And now the final step, which I am not able to finish now, is that, okay, you have this approximate solution, and then you have a true solution. I mean, this is a solution given by theorem 4. For any Dirac mass, any filament, you have a solution. Now we have an approximate solution, and you have a perturbation, okay? And the remainder of this approximation should be controlled. And we would like to show that it's of the order epsilon square for some time interval, hopefully for the convection time. If we can prove that, when we have proved that the solution behave like the approximation, so you can extract the formula for the binormal flow and all information you want about the solution. And now here at this point, it's surprisingly, it's where things start diverging with what was done by Pierre Germain yesterday. The tools that were used by Pierre Germain, which were in fact imported from previous work by me and Jean Wayne and other people, use some skew symmetry of some operators like the lambda we have, and use some energy estimates, and you obtain that you have control of your remainder. This breaks down completely here. So this delayed the project for long months because we didn't know how to do. And now we think we have an alternative approach. So it's very difficult to, I mean, it's very difficult for us. Maybe somebody will find some trick, but for us, it seems very difficult to control this remainder. And at least all things that have been used so far, and especially in 2D or even by Germain, Bedrosian, and Harop Griffiths for filaments, are not sufficient here to control this. Okay, so we are writing the details now, but this is so sensitive to little problems that I'm not able. For sure, we will be able to control this, but the question is for how long? Will the observation time depend on viscosity, and in which way? Okay, and so I'm not able to write a statement here because almost surely it will be wrong because of some terms that we will have neglected. But this is a project. I mean, we are nearly to the end. So we have a very precise asymptotic solution, I mean, approximate solution. This is no problem, and this is not new. In fact, it is written in the literature, or maybe in a more complicated way. And then this approximation is so precise that when you write the correction, you can just control it by a fixed point argument using energy estimates. And so in principle, hoping that we can do that, we should be able to do the vanishing viscosity limit for a single vortex filament, circular vortex filament in Navier-Stokes, assuming all flows are axisymmetric without swirl, and recover rigorously the binormal formula plus the correction and so on, because we have a good control on the remainder of the approximation. Whether or not such a strategy can be applied to a general filament is completely open. Here we use massively the simplification due to the 2D-like situation we are working in. I have absolutely no idea, but of course, conceptually, such a strategy could also be attacked in the general case. So, okay, that's all I can say. So thank you for your attention.